here. So welcome to this panel on environmental, social, and governance panel, the ESG panel. We have just 60 minutes. We have 3 panelists, and I'm your moderator. I want to give the panelists as much time to get through as much material as possible, so I'm going to give some very brief introductions, and then we'll jump right into the material. So I'm going to introduce to you the panelists. 2 of them you met earlier if you were in one of the student breakout sessions. So Mary Barth, who is in my lower left, is the Joan E. Horngren Professor of Accounting Emeritus at Stanford University Graduate School of Business. For this panel, the relevant things are that she's the Vice Chair of the Financial Accounting Foundation Board of Trustees, which oversees the Financial Accounting Standards Board and the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. There's a lot of acronyms built in there, and we've got several more in the next few introductions. In my lower right is Jeff Hale, Professor of Accounting at the UT Austin, so here. He's also the chair of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, again, another acronym, which is now part of the Value Reporting Foundation after having merged with the International Integrated Reporting Council. So Jeff and Mary, you might have seen earlier today. Then in my upper right, we have Rupert Thorne. Rupert is the Deputy Secretary General of the Financial Stability Board, located in Basel, Switzerland. So it's early to mid-evening for Rupert right now. Rupert coordinates the FSB work on climate change, and this work includes sponsoring the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, designing the FSB's climate roadmap, and working with the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. So he's got his finger in a lot of different pies there. And my name is John Schindler. I am a Senior Associate Director in the Division of Financial Stability at the Federal Reserve Board. I used to work with Rupert, so I have to stop myself from saying the Financial Stability Board, the Federal Reserve Board. And I currently chair the Fed's Financial Stability Climate Committee, which was stood up less than a year ago now. So then we're going to do this. We're going to start with just sort of some opening statements by each of our panelists. They're going to tell us a little bit about what it is that they're doing in this ESG space and tell us a little bit about what their organization does. So we agreed that Mary would go first. So each panelist is going to go for 3 or 4 minutes. So Mary, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, John, and I'm delighted to be here. This is a great panel. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Had a good time with the PhD students in the last session, so we're on a roll, I think. But before I begin, I'd like to make clear that the views I will be expressing are my own, and in particular may not represent the views of the Financial Accounting Foundation or of its standard-setting bodies, the Financial Accounting Standards Board and the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, and point out that as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Financial Accounting Foundation, I do not participate in setting standards or agendas or speak on behalf of the FASB or GASB. So now that we have that out of the way, I can speak my mind. So although I have done some research on the potential benefits of integrated reporting, which includes reporting on ESG. The truth is, at the moment, my work related to ESG really is centered around assessing whether, and if so, in what capacity the Financial Accounting Foundation or standard setting boards should be involved in ESG standard setting. As John mentioned, the FAF oversees the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which establishes US GAAP for for-profit and non-for-profit entities. And the Governmental Accounting Standards Board establishes US GAAP for state and local governments. As Tobias and Adrian said earlier in the opening panel, it seems clear that global investors need and want more information about ESG, information that's reliable, comparable, and neutral to help them make their decisions. Thus, a key issue facing the accounting profession today is what exactly that information is and who will develop standards for entities to follow in reporting it in the future. So that's my interest at the moment. I'll turn it over back to you, John.
Thanks, Mary. Let me turn it over to Jeff.
Great, thanks. So, as was mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Texas. I've been studying the importance of disclosure for my entire career. And I've spent time at the Financial Accounting Standards Board as a research fellow there. But for the last almost 10 years now, have been working with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board to develop guidance around how companies could disclose on issues that are not traditionally captured in financial statements, and I think a lot of people might argue maybe shouldn't be captured necessarily in financial statements. And so, so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, where should those lines be drawn, and how could guidance be provided, and when should guidance be provided that would actually help companies to provide information about their activities, and to whom. And I think those are big questions. So I thought I would use just a little bit of my time to talk about really just what SASB does in a nutshell. So SASB is basically a standard setting organization that we have patterned after the International Accounting Standards Board and the FASB's structure in terms of due process and trying to follow what we think of as best practice there. But the idea is to think about what are the issues that companies engage in that have external effects? What are the dependencies outside of their control that they depend on? And what information do markets need about that? And so rather than focusing on one issue like greenhouse gas emissions, albeit an important one, we think broadly around 26 different categories of topics. And for those topics, we then think about what do industries typically do? What do businesses in a given industry do, given what it might be a typical business model for those types of companies? And so we look at the intersection there. So really, in our economic universe, we carve it up into 11 sectors or 77 different industries. And so then we can kind of create a heat map. And in fact, we have one that you can look at on the website if you Google Materiality Map. And basically, it shows that as you might expect, the issues that are important for one company in a given industry are likely to be different than issues for other companies. So greenhouse gas emissions, really big issue for oil and gas companies, for power generators. But the amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced by an investment bank, very small directly, because unless they have like a stove that in their office lounge or something like that, that's happens to be gas, they won't have many direct emissions. And so very different business activities, but the financing of carbon types of carbon emissions is a big issue, and lending around companies' activities that are involved in the discovery of that could have big issues. And so thinking about finance companies' incorporation of ESG into its activities could be a very important issue, quite different from what an airline, for example, might consider. So really, SASB tries to think about that integration between what businesses do and what the types of issues are, and then develop specific guidance around topics and then performance metrics for those topics. And so we've done that. We have 77 industry standards. We have some guidance that rides above all of that, and so applies to all companies. And so we've got now probably about 1,200 or so companies that have started using the standards in some respect to report. Within the last few years, we only finished the standards for sort of like out of their provisional stage in November of 2018. So in a nutshell, that's what SASB has been doing, and what I sort of bring to this conversation.
Thank you, Jeff. And Rupert, I'm going to turn to you.
Thanks very much, John, and hello, everyone. So as John said, I work for the Financial Stability Board, or FSB, which is an international organization that coordinates global financial stability policy, as you might expect from the name. Our membership includes ministries of finance, central banks, supervisors, regulators from the G20 countries, together with international bodies such as the Basel Committee and the IMF. So Tobias Adrian, who chaired an earlier panel, he's actually a member of our plenary. We were formed in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, out of the realization there was a need for a strong package of financial reforms, not only to strengthen financial institutions individually, but also the resilience of the global financial system as a whole. And that this needed the partnership of advanced economies and emerging markets, as represented in the G20. But our interest in ESG is more recent, and it's tightly focused on climate-related financial risk, given our mandate to focus on financial stability, and given the urgency and the global nature of climate issues out of all the ESG topics. Although there's a vigorous debate about whether we should be starting to tackle some of the other issues as well. Our work started in 2015 when we established the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, to develop industry-led recommendations for voluntary climate disclosures. The motivation was to improve the information available to investors, lenders, and insurers about firms' climate-related financial risks and bring the subject more into the mainstream of investment decision-making. In doing so, we could help to reduce the risk of a future financial crisis being caused by a sudden market realization that there was a whole category of risk that had built up without being noticed, which is what we saw in 2008 on the back of really poor disclosures before then concerning subjects like subprime mortgages and structured finance. So we're trying to learn that lesson. The TCFD recommendations, they've gained enormous traction over the years. And meanwhile, we continue to promote them, but our work has also moved further on to analyze other financial stability risks from climate change, the broader set of data needed to assess the risks, and where there are data gaps. And most recently, last month, we published an overall roadmap for assessing and addressing climate-related financial risks that sets out the steps needed not only for disclosures and data, but also for vulnerabilities analysis and regulatory and supervisory policies. And I'll talk further about that as we go on. Thanks very much, John. Back to you.
Thanks, Rupert. Let me talk just very briefly. I'm using my role as a moderator to squeeze in on the conversation here a little bit. I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing at the Federal Reserve Board. So earlier this year, the Federal Reserve Board established the Financial Stability Climate Committee to assess how the potential effects of climate change could impact our statutory financial stability mandate. So from the Federal Reserve's perspective, and I should add a disclaimer like Mary did at the beginning, I'm speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of the Federal Reserve Board or the governors. The job of assessing the science of climate change, including the physical impacts and the extent of climate change, that falls to other people. We don't view that as part of our job. Our focus is on how those changes may relate to the financial system and how they may pose risks to financial stability. And I would just make a slight distinction between financial risks and financial stability risks. There could be a physical change that affects the profits of a particular financial institution. That would consider that a financial risk. If that is not a large institution, if it's not a systemic risk that's shared by many institutions, I would not view that as a financial stability risk. So the Financial Stability Climate Committee was formed to focus on these climate-related financial stability risks. And just to give you some examples, if you think about how opaque some of the exposures to climate risk are right now, or the various beliefs that people have, the various market participants about exposures to climate risks because of the degree of uncertainty, that could lead to different people pricing the same asset in different ways. And therefore, if new information comes out that causes us to shift our views, that you could see significant price shocks, potentially downward price shocks. Or things like the timing and uncertainty about severe weather events and disasters, as well as the relationship between those events and economic outcomes, could lead at some point in time to an abrupt repricing of assets, especially as there is new information. Recently, we got the new IPCC report. So that is the type of thing that could be a shock in the future. Climate risk can also create new vulnerabilities associated with the borrowing of households or businesses. They could be over-levered. They could be borrowing too much money. And if the value of their assets or income becomes impaired, for example, it's learned that you own a lot of real estate in an area where there's going to be an significant increase in the rate of hurricanes, for example, or the intensity of hurricanes. You could see a change in the pricing of your assets. So these are the sorts of things that we want to study to better analyze with analytical rigor. Right now, financial models might lack the precision or the geographic granularity that we need to convert information about how climate change will affect things to the value of assets and the exposure of others. And then the financial system is also vulnerable to amplification effects of these damages. If contracts aren't well written, if they're incomplete and they don't capture all the possible damages, especially in a very uncertain environment like this, or if poorly understood, financial exposures cause spillover effects or financial contagion. So I'm going to stop there. Now, for the remainder of this panel, I'm going to ask each of our three panelists a question, and then we'll go around on some research ideas that they're all going to offer to you. And time permitting, we'll get to some questions at the end from the audience. So let me turn first. I'm going to go to Jeff first. So Jeff, we heard the term sustainability about 5 different times from you and Mary. And you're all working on standards with respect to sustainability and financial accounting. So why is standardization so important? What if we don't have it? Where are we now? What are the next steps? So let me turn to you on that.
Yeah, thanks. So it's a great question. So first, I would say like the terms are a little tricky. So I usually think of like sustainability as relating to the ability of a company in a corporate context, the ability of a company to create value for its shareholders over the long term. And so that is going to not be independent of the impacts it has on the externalities that it imposes outside of it, because of its activities and the dependencies that are there. ESG is often a way that we think about what are some of the ways of identifying those externalities. So environmental issues and social issues broadly, what's the governance over that? One reason that standardization is really important is just take something like greenhouse gas emissions. What could we do with that if that information, if each company is preparing it in a different way? The greenhouse gas protocol provides some guidance around that says for different types of emissions, here's how we aggregate them together. For example, by converting them into a CO2 equivalent, and that's helpful for aggregation, but creates challenges because methane, for example, is very different in its implications for global warming compared to, say, just carbon dioxide. And so standardization, can at least put us on some of the same footing so that comparisons can start to be made. And comparability is really what the capital markets need. If you're going to form portfolios based on information, it has to be widely applied and comparable. And so that means you have to compare one company's risks and opportunities in a way that can be benchmarked against others. But I would have a caveat to that. This is not saying that every company needs to report everything in the same way. In fact, I would say that in financial accounting, the way that we account for an airplane is quite different when you sell them versus when you operate them, and that's really important to getting the comparability because they're using it differently, and to account for it in one particular way, just like say historical cost, even if you're selling it or operating it, could lead to, I think, lack of comparable information because you couldn't tell as well who's selling them versus who's actually operating them. A similar thing's true for ESG information, and so that's why at SASB we've been focused on thinking about what are the issues. Climate risk, very important, but very industry specific. Scope 1 emissions really are produced, 85% of them, by 7 industries. Electric utilities being one of the biggest, not surprisingly. If you're concerned about just Scope 1 emissions, you could skip out on almost 70 of the industries that are out there and focus on 7 and get like the lion's share of that handled. So that's one thing. But if you were worried about, say, like methane in particular, well, that's going to be in agriculture, fugitive emissions from your oil and gas companies, and then waste as it's decomposing. And so that would suggest a very different profile of industries that you might want to focus on there. So what we're interested in is like creating comparability by identifying the issues that are going to be important given the type of business activity that a company is engaged in, and then within that, make sure that there's guidance for the company to produce information that's going to be, would be similar even if another company were trying to produce the same information. And that plays really important roles for thinking about how the whole system works. For ratings and ratings agencies to actually evaluate corporate performance, they need information that's comparable and reliable. In order to get third-party assurance, there needs to be some clear standards for how you're producing the information so that somebody can verify it. For software providers to want to produce technologies that will help with the collection of the data and reduce some of the costs around that, there needs to be some sort of standardization there. So that's why it's also important to get standards. Where it's going is you can expect a lot more. I don't have time in my few minutes here to really, maybe we can come back to that in some of the Q&A, but you can expect a lot more standardization and probably mandatory requirements, although there's a lot of nuance to what exactly any of that means that we can dive into.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that. I'll turn to Mary now. Jeff has made the case for why standards are important. Mary, a couple of the agencies that you are affiliated with, FAF and the SASB, are playing roles in ESG standard setting. So what are the roles? What are the pros and cons, the good and the bad of those roles? And where are we in this process of setting these standards that are, as Jeff said, really important for how companies react?
That's a big question. So taking up a lot of time and energy trying to sort this out. But I think, let me just start by saying that after a public consultation process, the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, which is our counterpart of our organization internationally, oversees the International Accounting Standards Board, is working towards establishing a global sustainability standards board under its umbrella, and is working with the Value Reporting Foundation that, John, that you mentioned earlier, which is combined International Integrated Reporting Council and the SASB, to try to create this board to create global standards that Jeff was talking about. The question is, what does that mean for the US and what does it mean for the US standard setting machinery? And I think when I think about the Financial Accounting Foundation, the role we could take could take on several forms. It's really just not clear. For example, the outcome could be that we would have a third full-fledged ESG standard setting body under our oversight, sort of a sister organization, if you will, to the FASB and the GASB. That's one possibility. There could be a board charged with modifying or adding or subtracting from the global standards to make them fit better within the US financial reporting system. There could be another type of board that was really more of an endorsement board to consider, for example, whether standards set by the whatever board the IFRS Foundation sets up, whether the standards set by that organization are suitable for the United States to be brought to the United States as is or with minor modifications, or some combination thereof. There's a wide range of how this should look. And the FASB focuses on ensuring ESG matters are incorporated into existing GAAP when it is appropriate, but otherwise really is not doing anything specific in this space. Pros and cons, many of the pros and cons for each of these possible roles are obvious, I think. The closer you have to a full-fledged board, the role is, the more input the US would have over the standards. However, setting up a full-fledged board would require finding more individuals, board members and staff with ESG experience and expertise. This is a very fast-moving, relatively new area, and those folks are few and far between. I'm sure Jeff is going to have many opportunities to make his expertise useful in this endeavor. But it also would undoubtedly result in more divergence from global standards, take longer to put into place, and be more costly. So there are pros and cons there for the full-fledged board. Further you get away from that, all those things, the pros and cons kind of slide depending on how far away you go. Doing something as opposed to doing nothing has a potential to mobilize the FAF organization's highly respected standard setting leadership, experience, and processes that we always apply to financial reporting standards, apply those things to ESG matters. It also seems to me that migrating various ESG matters from the ESG entity to FASB, as those matters become more a key part of financial reporting, would likely be more seamless than migrating them from an outside entity. But that's just speculation. But the problem is, the con is that ESG reporting, I think it's fair to say, is a highly political space. The question is, we talk in this group, we're talking about standards, about financial stability, about financial risk and financial reporting, but there's more to ESG than that. And someone described it to me as, don't take this literally, but it kind of frames it. You know, one perspective is that it's what is the ESG doing to the company, and the other is what is the company doing to ESG matters. So take the environment, for example. And I think the role of the FAF and the FASB is more on what the effect is on the company, as opposed to how the company is affecting the world. But that's not what everybody wants, and there's more to ESG. It's not saying those other things are not important. It's just that that's where financial reporting has been. So there is a concern that taking on all of ESG or getting involved in it could jeopardize the independence and neutrality of financial reporting standard setting, which has proven so crucial to the US capital markets. Now, SASB is my understanding, and Jeff can correct me on this, but I think SASB has been guided by sort of a financially material kind of boundary. People have different names for this, and I would expect the FAF to do the same, but clear boundaries are difficult to draw in gray areas, and I think that this area is quite gray. And then a practical concern is the source of funding. Right now, FAF and the FASB, the FASB is funded by accounting support fees that are provided for in Sarbanes-Oxley. And then obviously funding would have to be arranged for whatever role the FAF assumes here. Where does the decision-making process stand? Well, let me first observe that the FASB does currently play a role insofar as ESG matters affect financial reporting. The FASB, like the International Accounting Standards Board, has issued a paper describing how ESG matters affect financial reporting today. A key question for the FASB is whether it needs to make these effects clearer, increase disclosures relating to them, or identify additional areas in which ESG matters should be taken into account. And the good news is the FASB currently has an open agenda consultation, which asks respondents questions about ESG related disclosures and ESG related transactions, such as emissions allowances and carbon offsets. The comment period ends September 22nd, so all of you on this call still have time to weigh in on what you think the FASB should be doing. But regarding other possible FAF involvement, the decision-making process, I'm going to say it's evolving. The FAF is working to understand the issues of the alternative roles I just described and the pros and cons, but the decision really is not FAF's alone to make. The SEC has a key role to play here. If the SEC decides to set standards itself or designate another standard setter as the standard setter in this space, then the FAF's role, at least as it pertains to firms under the SEC purview, will be defined for it. And the SEC's decision, whatever it is likely to have a significant impact on the FAF's role regarding its other constituencies as well. It appears that in the short term, the SEC is going to do some rulemaking on climate and human capital. What role it will keep for itself in the longer term, or who it's going to designate on ESG matters in the longer term, is less clear to me. Although it seems to be, many times it seems that things are moving very rapidly, but on the other hand, it still takes time, thought, and consultation to develop an implementable plan and make it a reality. So all I can say is watch this space, and we will all find out together.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to turn to Rupert now. Rupert, Mary mentioned, at one point she mentioned IFRS, which I know is a group that the FSB has had some recent engagement with. So can you tell us a little bit more about the role that the FSB plays in coordinating the work of the other standard setting bodies, and why right now that's so important in the context of all the attention given to the climate change issue?
Yeah, be happy to. I got distracted a little bit by realizing, by the way, that all four of us work on boards, and that it's important to distinguish the FSB from the SASB, the FASB, and the FRB. So that's vital that you keep that in mind. I'm going to try and keep the acronyms to a minimum here, which is always challenging this work. As we all know, there's been a huge increase in attention to climate change policies this year. And this has resulted in a proliferation of work, not least by financial authorities and international organizations. And we've heard about some of it already. And that greater momentum in climate work is very welcome, but it also increases the importance of good coordination and clear communication. And I think Jeff and Mary have both illustrated this. Otherwise, there's a real risk of duplication and reinventing the wheel, or even worse, conflicting instructions and advice. So the overall framework that we're using for coordination in the FSB on financial stability is the tool I mentioned earlier, the roadmap for assessing and addressing climate-related financial risks. It's on our website. And that roadmap has 4 blocks of work. The first of them is on promoting high-quality, comparable company disclosures, both by non-financial firms and by financial institutions. And we're actively encouraging the work of the IFRS that Mary mentioned, the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, to develop a common global minimum standard for sustainability disclosures, starting with climate and based on the recommendations of the TCFD, the industry-led body that I mentioned earlier. And that TCFD is also working very closely with SASB, so this is not a matter of competition here. So I'd like to emphasize that's a global minimum standard. It's not aiming to provide total uniformity around the world, as with many areas, but in particular a new area like this, it's important not to stifle the ability to innovate and improve on that global minimum. So this work is already underway at the IFRS and it's getting important support from the securities industry standard setter, IOSCO, because the main route for adoption of disclosure standards is through requirements for company listing and public securities issuance. And that's in the national case, that's the role the SEC is playing, broadly speaking. But this isn't just a matter for securities regulators. The content of those disclosures are important for bank and insurance supervisors and for ministries of finance too. And I'm talking here only about the authorities concerned with financial stability. So there are many others interested, but we play an important coordinating role among those financial sectoral standard setters, along with the accounting standard setters. In the past, we've helped with IASB, FASB coordination, I hope, and then in building support with politicians through our links with the G20, which created us. And that's a similar role we played in encouraging improved consistent disclosure standards following the 2008 financial crisis. So that's the first area of our roadmap. The second area is about improving data for climate-related financial risk management more broadly, not just the data that comes from individual companies. Translating different scenarios for climate change and different scenarios for climate mitigation and adaptation policies into measurable financial exposures and financial risks is a new subject, and we're still in the process of identifying what data we need and how to collect it. We're coordinating here with sectoral standard setters and with other bodies such as the NGFS, which is the grouping of central banks working on green finance, and the IMF to coordinate action to fill these data gaps. So that's the second area, data. The third area, which builds on those, is vulnerabilities assessment. John was talking about this earlier. As with other types of financial stability threat, we need to develop a rigorous framework for analyzing the vulnerabilities of the financial system and the resilience that they have. To do that, we need to continue to understand better the channels of risk transmission between different sectors. For instance, channels that may amplify risk, perhaps through concentrated exposures or through liquidity needs, or channels that reduce risk, such as through insurance provision. We need to develop new tools to do this analysis, not least because the time horizons we're looking at are much longer than the typical short-term focus of financial supervision on more cyclical risks. And the fourth area of our roadmap is coordinating where needed regulatory and supervisory policy making. And I stress here, this is coordination where needed. the primary initial task for regulation and supervision lies with the sectoral standard setters to consider how to reflect climate issues in their existing frameworks. What does it mean for Basel III for banks? What does it mean for the insurance core principles for insurance supervisors? They're doing that work now, a gap analysis. And we can play a role by acting as a forum to share experiences, consider cross-sectoral issues, consider macroprudential policies. And in all this work, we're acting as a communicating body, two-way, between the technicians, the supervisors, the regulators, and the standard setters, and the political leaders. And this gets to a point Mary was making. We're helping to build political support for the necessary actions that have been developed at the technical level, make sure this is well-founded, and to organise and coordinate the work at the technical level to carry out in a practical way the high-level political agreements that are negotiated in the G20. So that's in a nutshell the function we're performing, John. It's an exciting one, and I encourage you all to join this as a career.
Thank you, Rupert, and thank you, Mary and Jeff. So I want to shift gears a little bit. We've told you a little bit about what we do, what some of the key issues are. And I know the interest of a lot of people attending today is, how do I turn this into a research agenda? What questions can I be ripping out there and throwing down and having a fight with and using new data for? So for this next, we're going to go around. I'll start this time and talk a little bit about some open research questions that we think are ripe for, analytical rigor, for, scientific inquiry. And, time permitting, we might have some time for questions. So if people want to put questions into the chat room, hopefully after we do this go round, we can turn to some questions. So I'll start, and I think Rupert's going to follow me. So in terms of some questions that I wanted to throw out there, in the climate change and financial stability space, and probably the financial risk space more generally, I think the thing that's lacking right now is analytical rigor. There have been many channels of transmission from climate change to financial stability or financial risk that have been hypothesized out there, but the links between those two haven't been quantified. So think about a set of questions. So you have physical risk. So what climate does in terms of temperature, sea level, storm intensity, etc. How much will that affect the price of various assets, and which assets are going to be most affected, which assets are going to be insulated? So knowing which ones are most affected, you can get some guess as to how asset valuations might be affected in the future, or just the uncertainty around those asset valuations. That's an important concept. Which institutions are exposed to those assets, particularly the ones that are most exposed to climate? If you then can figure out which institutions are most exposed, then you can figure out when there are shocks that hit, be they information shocks or actual physical climate shocks, or a transition effect, a policy shock. Which institutions are going to be the most affected by this? How levered are those financial institutions? Are they highly levered, in which case you would expect a bigger amplification of the shock around the financial system? How are the assets funded that are most exposed to climate change risk, to the physical risk of climate change, for example? Are these long-term assets funded with long-term liabilities, or is there some sort of maturity transformation or some sort of mismatch between the funding and the asset itself? And then what are the interconnections with other institutions? If I am a bank that has lent heavily to a exposed area that's at high risk for future physical effects from climate change, have I borrowed from other institutions? Am I lending to other institutions? What are those connections that could cause cascading effects in the future? The same questions could be asked about transition risk. I started with the physical risks here, but what about transition risk, and how can we quantify those? Those might be a little bit different, but we could ask, if there's a new technology, if there's a new policy, which assets are most affected? Who holds those assets? Who's exposed to those assets? And who's exposed to those institutions? We could bring out the interconnections chain again. And then a question that's slightly different, and I think it is quantifiable, though I haven't seen any work on this yet, but one of the things we talk about when we talk about transition risk is policy risk. There could be a new change, a carbon tax or something like that. how does this policy risk or this transition risk differ from any other area where there might be policy risk? We talk a lot about the policy risk with respect to climate change, but aren't there policy risks with everything? If yes, why is this one different? And that's my attempt to give you some ideas of things to work on. I'm going to turn to Rupert next. So Rupert, please.
So I think that's a really good list, John, and not just because you're the moderator of this panel. I think you've well laid out the fundamental questions that there's really a large number of them that we seriously need better research on. I'll just add one or two glosses of current issues from my perspective that are challenging, and I'd be really interested in researching. And I listened to the research presentations earlier, and I was really impressed with the work there. I think it illustrates that there's a lot that can be produced from academia to add to what's being done in the public sector to improve that. So, a couple of ideas here in just at random. As we've discussed, climate disclosures by firms are not yet very standardized in the information they provide, their format, or even their location within company reporting. How can artificial intelligence be used to analyze the information that is available from disclosures and the quality of those disclosures? That's something that people are looking at. We heard something in the research today, but I think that's still ample space. So that one doesn't, for instance, be scoring a company well for, say, they've covered disclosures and turn out that artificial intelligence lighted on a sentence that said, I have nothing to say on climate or something. Just picked up the word climate in the machine learning. That's a frivolous example, but the challenge of actually being able to take this disorganized data and much of which is qualitative and develop patterns from it, I think there's a lot can be done there. A different topic. So we've talked today about there being rapid work underway to develop international standards for company disclosures that are comparable and decision useful. And understandably, the leading examples there are disclosures by large companies who are able to devote large analytical resources to sophisticated analysis. And this is leading to concerns elsewhere that firms in emerging markets or small and medium enterprises will not be able to meet those standards for disclosures and will be disadvantaged. I'm hoping that's a concern that we can prove will end up being not well founded. But what form should disclosures by emerging market firms or small and medium enterprise firms take that are feasible for them to provide with limited resources, but are still informative to investors and other stakeholders? I think research on that is a big gap at the moment. A third topic, considering global risks, it's important to understand spillover risks from one country to another. So more research on what form those spillover effects can take in the event of bad climate scenarios, potentially combining weather-related or policy-related spillovers, cross-border financial exposures, or disorderly cross-border capital flows. How can these be taken account of in assessing the risks? Those are some topics, they're quite challenging, which I'm really interested in. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rupert. And I'm next going to turn to Mary, and then Jeff will back clean up for us.
Thank you, John. It's interesting to hear the questions from John and Rupert. They would all make great questions in financial reporting as well. The issues are the same. They just have, you think about it from a different perspective, and you're looking for little, different effects at the end of the day, but they're all very important questions that we do not know the answers to. There are so many important questions, but some of the questions that come to my mind with respect to when I'm put my financial reporting researcher hat on is, what specific information do investors need relating to ESG? Investors always seem to want a lot of information. Companies don't like to provide a lot of information. It's costly to do it. And so that we have to find this sweet spot between what serving investors' needs with things that companies can provide. So what exactly do they need? Because they're not going to get everything. So we have to focus on their needs. Should some of that information be included in financial statements today? If we're talking about financially material information, does it belong in financial reporting or is it separate? And if it does belong there, what information should be included in the financial statements and what information shouldn't in some other report or whatever? Do ESG standards need to be industry specific? Jeff mentioned industry, and I think he probably has a perspective on this, and maybe they need to be, but the financial accounting system has been brought up trying to avoid industry specific standards. Yes, particular industry assets, liabilities, or reporting issues like insurance liabilities or financial assets for financial institutions. But they're not really industry specific standards. If we need to go there, that would be a change, but we need to think about if there's information that firms have in common that all companies should be disclosing, that's a different story. One thing that I don't understand is how entities can obtain information to enable them to report scope 3 emissions. And I'll come back to this question a little bit later. Another question is how are investors supposed to aggregate this information or metrics within an entity and across entities? Rupert mentioned artificial intelligence, thinking about the disclosures. But if we have a bunch of ESG metrics, and there are a lot of them, there's tons of CO2, how do we aggregate those metrics to try to be helpful to investors in figuring out the effect of all of this stuff collectively on the entity? That's one of the things we do with finance. One of the nice things about financial information is it's all in currency, so you can add it up. It may be adding apples and oranges depending on how it's determined, but you can add it up. I'm struggling with how to help investors take all of this information and aggregate it and summarize it. That's a role accountants usually play. How do ESG non-financial metrics in combination help predict future financial outcomes? We got a little discouraging news on that today in the research presentations. But I think there's more work to be done to figure out exactly whether it's because they're not important, people think they are important, or whether there's something we could do better with the metrics. Which ESG matters pose firm level risk, and what metrics capture that risk? How do investors assess ESG matters in their portfolios? Is there systematic risk involved, which is what Rupert, I think, and John are talking about? Stability risk is more like a systematic risk for the entire economy. Which ESG matters pose that risk, and what metrics capture that? How do investors avoid double counting in their portfolios? Particularly if you think about scopes 1, 2, and 3. If everybody's counting scope 3 emissions, we're going to be multiplying by a very big number here. So we have to help investors figure out how to count it, but not double count it. And this financial materiality, I come back to this, where is the boundary with financial materiality? Is there evidence that the SASB has gotten it right? And if they haven't quite got it right, how can it be improved? Is it even possible to draw such a line, or do we need to? I mean, at the end of the day, is all ESG information decision relevant to investors? I don't really know, but I think these are the kinds of questions that I would like to see answered in the financial reporting space.
Thank you, Mary. And to the students out there, I think we're up to like 35 questions for you to answer now. So you've got a good start there. Jeff, let me turn to you for the final set of questions.
Sure. So I'm not so much going to offer a lot of new questions necessarily, but just offer a few comments on what I've heard. So, John, one of the things you mentioned was thinking about policy risk, which I think is a really great, it's a great thing to think about, and whether this is different than other types of policy risks. And so, one way I would think about that is, first of all, you can motivate a paper around policy risks, even if it's not a different type of policy risk. It still may be relevant. That said, there might be something about climate risk, in particular, policy issues around the policy risks related to climate that might be different, right? Sometimes, a lot of times, policy changes come in the aftermath of something terrible. This is one that actually is very widespread, has been scientifically studied for decades, and so we're, I think, on the cusp of seeing, a lot of new regulation but not necessarily after, after one major event. If you think like the financial crisis and what happened after that. So I think there may be some aspects about it that are different, although it doesn't necessarily have to be different to be an important thing to study. Um, you know, Rupert, you mentioned some of the issues around smaller entities being able to handle some of the reporting requirements that might be asked of them. And I just wanted to comment that reminds me in some ways of the issues that we've heard about, for example, when trying to apply very technical accounting. So for example, like fair value assessments and measurements, especially when you move beyond level 1 fair value measurements to things that are maybe more complicated to assess. Valuation is challenging. Oftentimes involving very different risks and prospects and boiling them down into one number. It's something that is hard, may require lots of estimation, may be difficult to verify other than that, the method that they were trying to apply was actually applied. So a lot of parallels, I think, that might be there. But when you think about this for climate risks in particular, I think that, small and medium entities, even large ones, are going to have real challenges around trying to assess physical risks in particular. I think that's one of the things that we're learning. And scenario analysis is hard. We don't have a lot of, a whole industry around how to do it, accepted technologies for it. And so that is going to create some challenges. And then, to Mary, because she's an accounting professor, our hearts are very close. And so I totally agree with all the things that she said. I mean, one way I would sum up some of what she said, she said, like, are these the right issues? Has SASB sort of got the things right? One of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is some of this research on measurement. And I would say, like, it's always important to remember that, like, every measure is wrong. All of the measures are wrong, right? And all of the measures probably carry like real consequences and distorting consequences once they become important. And so like it's really important that we think about how to create a system that is going to be helpful with that respect. And so that's going to be important. But when I think again of like parallels to things, what have been some of the intractable issues that we've just studied for decades in financial accounting? There are things like, should we use historical costs? Should we use fair values? There's a challenge in an accounting system where you're talking about debits and credits. You got to put one of those into the system. You can't put them both into the system. And so there's a real debate there. But when you're thinking about disclosure for the accountants in the audience, talking about something rather than putting it into a system with debits and credits and recognizing it, that's the way we describe that, and measuring it in a particular way, you can actually capture more dimensionality. You can capture more than one angle of a particular issue, measure it in more than one way. And so I think there are going to be some really important fundamental questions around when is it more helpful to have sort of an industry agnostic way? Should we transform different activities into one measure to Mary's aggregatable point? So take CO2 versus methane. Getting a carbon equivalent there might be a really great way to compare oil and gas company and a metals and mining company, which might otherwise have a pretty different profile. But then when we go beyond that to like the scope 3, like essentially like supply chain emissions, when we think about human capital issues, diversity, especially when we go beyond gender to like underrepresented minorities or other aspects of diversity characteristics, can you get a global measure for companies within a portfolio of like whether there are risks there and how do you do that? Real challenges around that. And so when do we want to have different measures for different business activities? And when do we want something that's more aggregatable, for example, like scope 1 carbon equivalents? So I'll just stop there. I see we got some questions.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, Mary and Rupert as well. We do have a couple of questions in the chat room. So let me try to summarize Derek's question, and then I will open it up to our three panelists. So Derek is particularly asking about ops risk. And he says there's little focus on disclosure of op risk. So what is the potential future for disclosure about your ops risk? And I think we think the Fed is also a bank supervisor. We think about our supervised institutions. They should be accounting for things like credit risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk in their own risk management. Do they have to disclose this? So let me open it up to any of the three panelists on disclosure of ops risk. What's the status? What's the future? Rupert, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, once I get the mute button sorted out. Yeah, the look, I think it's a very good question, and one that's dear to my heart, because as I say, we are in the business in the Financial Stability Board of looking at the financial risk to firms, not the effect they have on the environment. That's important, but it's not our job. And you know, typically people break that down into the three categories: physical, transition, and legal risk, and with a real focus on the physical and transition risk. And transition risk, measuring that policy aspect is difficult. And I very often hear colleagues say, well, for transition risk, can't we use as a proxy the ESG rating? Because this shows their vulnerability on the policy side. I'm a great believer that that is a very poor proxy, because the ESG rating is often measuring, are you a good firm or a bad firm? I'm simplifying that slightly. That doesn't equate at all to whether you are exposed or not exposed to a significant sudden change in government policy. So I would really like to see a clearer focus on the exposure of firms operationally or indeed financially in the credit and liquidity sense to major changes in authorities' policies. For instance, obviously, in the introduction of carbon pricing, which is not about them being good or bad, but is about a major change in policy that could occur.
Thanks, Rupert. Mary or Jeff, do you want to take a stab at that, or I can also move on to Jeff's question?
Jeff, do you want to go ahead, or?
I would just say that there are some industries that SASB looks at where we capture things like supply chain risk, especially like that's a way that we think in some industries of climate risk manifesting itself, through a supply chain disruption. So there are, depending on the type of industry, I think there are angles there where we try to capture some of the operational side of it, just your ability to continue to deliver on the products or services that you're providing.
I guess the only thing that I would add is I agree with Rupert's perspective. It's interesting. We don't do a lot about reporting on operational risks in general for firms. If you think about what's in the current financial reporting package, there's precious little about operating risk. There are, people use proxies for, how much variable costs and, this sort of thing, fixed cost versus variable cost, but it's at a very high level. So what the question brought to mind, Jeff's comment about when is ESG a good setting to look at maybe what we should be doing more generally across not just ESG, but broader operational risks. Maybe that's something that really belongs in, companies should be grappling with and disclosing and trying to sort out. And ESG is a good example of that, because I don't think we do a very good job with operational risk for other things.
So let me turn to Jeffrey's question here, and if I could summarize it, he asked, what are the objectives for standard setters with respect to ESG standards? Is this driven by the fact that investors need this information, or is this driven by, a set of people, politicians, trying to encourage firms to behave more sustainably in an environmentally friendly way? So do any of our panelists want to venture a stab there? Mary, you're not muted, so maybe I'm going to call on you first.
Well, I think that, Jeffrey, that's a great question. And that's actually the distinction that I was trying to make. And I think both of these things are important. The question is, who's responsible for what? And I think Rupert used that comment a minute ago, saying it's important, but it's not his job. And it's the main purpose of the FAF and the FASB comes from the Securities Acts of 1933 and 1934 through the SEC. The SEC delegates its responsibility, its authority to issue financial reporting standards that will be used by firms in the financial capital markets. So that's really what is kind of the big picture of why we're thinking about drawing this line of financial materiality and not. And that's, so in that sense, if you're talking about standard setters being like the FASB, and probably the IFRS Foundation, I think, I won't speak for SASB, Jeff can speak for the way they viewed this. But that's why they focus on really what's useful, value relevant information for investors, helping investors make their capital allocation decisions, financial capital allocation decisions, not being more putting pressure on firms to be more responsible. That's not it's not important to do that. It's just not within the realm of these particular standard setters. And that's the boundary that I was talking about. It's very difficult, I think, to make. And there's concern if we don't try to make that boundary, then we start slipping into an area that we really have no authority to set standards in.
Jeff or Rupert?
I might just quickly add that it's important to remember that like the FASB's mandate is narrower than, say, the SEC's mandate, and Congress has a much wider mandate in terms of what they need information about and what they're trying to encourage, and that's totally appropriate and fine. And the IFRS Foundation actually is a little bit different because they're not sitting directly under an SEC, so they have a management commentary project, which imagines disclosures that are much broader than the types of things that you might see the FASB produce, for example, because some of that's very close to what the SEC has, and so FRAG, which is likely to set standards for the European Union, it will have an even broader mandate, for example, than the IFRS Foundation, because again, it's trying to meet the needs of policymakers more broadly, and like taxes, ESG activities are going to be an important policy issue, not just a value issue, although I think there's clearly evidence that there's going to be both angles present, and so sorting these issues out is tricky, as Mary points out. Completely agree with that.
Rupert, did you want to add anything?
Well, just briefly, conscious of the time, there's obviously a very vigorous debate on this sort of topic and a range of views, including some slightly different perspectives in Europe and America. There's a concept that some of the private sector standard setters, including, I think, SASB, are talking about, of dynamic materiality, which is a recognition that, as Mary has said, what people think about as material, that question evolves a little bit over time, and it's in the end it's a matter for investors and other stakeholders to determine, and that's why the IFRS approach seems likely to start with a building block approach, starting relatively conservatively with things more focused on financial risk, and will explore the ability to go further. That's at least what they've been talking about in their consultation. We'll see what happens there. Mary, I hope I haven't mangled the accounting terminology there too much.
Well, I will give a 3-second answer to Jeffrey, which is think about supply and demand. I'm the economist, so I got to think that. Who is demanding the information? Certainly it's investors. Why are they demanding it? It might be because they want to invest in a more environmentally responsible way or a socially responsible way. So there could be an underlying demand to encourage them to treat it more like a carrot as opposed to just a requirement coming from above. So I think the answer is both. But I want to thank our panel. I think we've run out of time. We've gone a few minutes over. I appreciate Mary, Jeff, and Rupert taking their time from 3 corners of the globe to be with us today. And I'm sure everybody would applaud, or I guess nowadays we click an applause emoji to thank our panelists. So thank you, everybody. Greatly appreciate the time, and sorry to the people whose questions we didn't get to, but maybe we can find a way to get answers to your questions offline. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.